Chattel slavery is a type of slavery carried out by the Americas as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. There are two basic types, domestic and field slaves. Domestic slaves perform household duties and field slaves produce marketable goods. Field slaves had a lower status than domestic slaves. Slaves can be bought, sold, and traded. Their status in society was extremely low. For example, as you would not concern yourself with the comfort of, say, a chair, a slave owner would not concern themselves with the comfort of their slaves. Chattel slavery heavily influenced the system of the slave trade for the rest of its existence. The way chattel slaves were treated laid the foundation for how all slaves were treated in the future and is the source of the ideology that slaves were not human. This mindset continued until changes were made in specific countries and racism continued for much longer than that.
When colonists arrived in North America, they were unable to force the Native Americans living there to work on plantations. However, there was still a high demand for cheap labor. In order to acquire the cheap labor that they sought, North American colonists hired indentured servants from Europe. Indentured servants were people who were generally not well off in their current society. Several were either homeless, in debt, or were criminals. In order to start a new life and get out of debt, they would sell themselves to work as servants without pay for a fixed number of years. The average indentured servant was under contract for 4 to 7 years. In exchange for their servitude, indentured servants received a free trip to the North American colonies to start their new life. They were also provided with food, housing, and other life necessities. Indentured servitude was also appealing to the aforementioned type of people because they hoped to become independent and self-sustained after their contract was over. Unfortunately, this was not the case. Life as an indentured servant was very difficult, and many died of disease or overwork before completing their terms of labor. Several of those who did survive found themselves having to work for minimal wages. Eventually, North American colonists began to import African slaves. Indentured servitude remained, but was not as prominent or significant as before.
Encomiendas and Haciendas were a Spanish development that spread from New Spain to the Portuguese colonies in the Americas. Encomiendas and Haciendas had very similar setups. They were both large estates with a Native American workforce.
Encomiendas came first and established the social relations between Spaniards and American natives based on their economic dominance and success. Unlike encomiendas, haciendas produced not only for European consumers, but also for wealthy American estate holders. The work on both of the estates were very similar. Usually the laborers would do farm work, but some estate holders sent their laborers to the mines that they owned. Haciendas had one more difference. The workers on these estates usually had left their native village to avoid taxation by the Spanish or Portuguese government. However, they were not better off, for they were treated like European serfs by their hacienda owner.
The Mita was an Incan system of slave labor. It was a mandatory public service in which all men had to participate in. At first, the Incan rulers used it on their own people. After the Spaniards came and began to control the Incas, they adopted and used a Mita system themselves to force the Native Americans to work for them. Considered a labor tax, they forced people from their villages to work for several months at a time. One example of a very large Mita labor population was around the mining city of Potosi. There were some wages involved, but there were also many abuses in the system. The labor requirements that were forced upon the Incas had a disruptive and destructive effect on the Native American life.